It's okay, Ali. We know you're trying to survive the apocalypse.
Yes. Very fortunate. Yeah.
Shall we go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it okay that I'm here?
Just remember I'm doing a kind of a poetic intro, and then I'm going to introduce myself.
Okay.
Life goes on around me, and with a clarity that has grown sharply painful, I see its ridiculous force on the bank, like millions before it and millions lapping after it. I know there is a flowing stream, only there is no portion of the stream, no part of all this flowing into which I can fling myself and say, here I belong, this is my home, here I shall do the work of my life. I do not know where I am. Perhaps I am the spume, a little speck of fugitive water sent up into the air by huge waves in their crashing against hard obstacles. Even the smaller hopes I had have fled. I have had large dreams, and I have learnt not to want to speak of their death. But that small, harmless hopes should also have crumbled into nothing, that is so cruel. I had hoped, accepting that I am forever to be the rejected spume. I have hoped still to be able to hold on to something beautiful in the life that is left, much as an isolated drop might in itself capture the light of the sun in a rainbow that does not arc over great distances or at any great length of time, but still in its shrunken round self containing an image of larger beauty. I would not have written of changes in the lives of whole peoples because I had stopped and come to stop thinking in such futile ways. That was part of my death. The thing I hoped to hold was love, the attraction of one person to his opposite, to her opposite, to their opposite, the power that brings the white to the black and leads them all to open to each other areas of themselves which they have long kept hidden from everybody else. La vie se poursuit autour de moi, et avec une clarté douloureuse, je vois sa ridicule force sur la rive. Comme des millions avant elle et des millions après elle, je sais qu'il y a un ruisseau qui coule. Seulement, il n'y a aucune parcelle du ruisseau, aucune tranche de tout ce flux dans laquelle je peux me jeter et dire « c'est ma place, c'est ma maison, c'est ici que j'accomplirai le travail de ma vie. Je ne sais pas où je suis. Peut-être suis-je l'écume, une petite tache d'eau fugitive envoyée en l'air par d'énormes vagues qui se heurtent à de durs obstacles. Même les petits espoirs que j'avais se sont enfuis. J'ai eu des grands rêves et j'ai appris à ne pas vouloir reparler de leur disparition. Mais que les espérances les plus petites et les plus anodines se soient également effondrées dans le néant, c'est si cruel. J'avais espéré tout en acceptant d'être à jamais l'écume rejetée. J'avais espéré être encore capable de retenir quelque chose de beau dans la vie qui me reste. Un peu comme une goutte isolée peut capturer la lumière du soleil dans un arc-en-ciel qui ne s'étend pas sur de grandes distances, ni sur une grande période de temps, mais qui, dans sa rondeur anodine, contient une image de la plus grande beauté. Je n'aurais pas écrit sur les changements dans la vie de peuples entiers, parce que j'avais cessé de penser de manière aussi futile. C'était une des composantes de ma mort. Ce que j'espérais retenir, c'était l'amour. L'attirance d'une personne pour son opposé, le pouvoir qui approche et qui rapproche le blanc du noir et les amène toutes à s'ouvrir les unes aux autres des zones d'eux-mêmes qu'ils ont longtemps cachées à tous les autres. My name is James Oscar, and I'd like to welcome you to my residency at the Fonderie Darling, which will take place between January 2022 until December 22, the whole year. And those were the words of Ayi Kwei Arma from his book, Fragments, one of the most important writers that's ever come out of the continent. To me, it speaks a lot about where we are and about some of the divisions that seem to not be resolving themselves. My project and my residency is called the New Region of the World. And in the first instance, it is a response and a seeking to emerge out of the current polarizations that we find ourselves in the world of culture, in the world of cultural production, and in the world of the transmission of culture. On one side, finding some groups seeking to be included and placed in history, sometimes called the woke, sometimes called other things. And then on the other side, there is an institutional stasis, a frozen state of being, which has begun to think through these questions, but not quite completely. To be true, much of this landscape has come to resemble something of a caricature, almost like an animation about the binaries of good and evil. And it's become a circular and circularity that has evaded any particular eventual resolve. My question for this residency is, how do we move inside of these debates? As my mentor, Edouard Glissant, said, the most well-founded certainties, when it happens that when the certainties dive to meet a bottom, it says that we are now entering into a new region of the world. This designates its place on all the given and imaginal expanses. And better said in French, les certitudes les plus fondées, quand ils arrivent que la plongée aux certitudes rencontre un fond, disent que nous entrons maintenant dans une nouvelle région du monde, qui désigne ces lieux sur toutes les étendues données imaginables et dont seuls quelques-uns avaient pu prévoir au loin les errances et les obscurités. My interest is in looking at this juncture we're at in history. In this sense, we understand that what has hitherto been understood as an exhaustive history and a total history of art and philosophy, or as Glissant notes, the most well-founded certainties, which they claim to be, it has at this time, those certainties at this time, have come to the point of being called into question. They have reached their bottom. They have reached a bottom. And they've reached the bottom of the claims to being the only history of art and the only history of thinking. In this sense, the West's claim to its well-founded certainties have reached an apogee. The certainties reaching the bottom of its universal claims, and now this new region of the world, being considered as other claims to also being part of the history of art and thinking. New ideas, artists, and forms of thinking, of which only a few had been able to foresee their existence in the past and in the present. Thus, who are these artists, past and present, that must be considered critical to the history of art and thinking? How can we remap the history of art and thinking to reveal these lacunae that constitute new, hitherto not considered, so-called new regions of the world? The urgent need to consider the pertinence of considering other histories of art and thinking has been sanctioned globally. You can see this at the MoMA with their program Post-MoMA. You can see this with the Tate Modern and several exhibitions they've done over the last few years where they've allowed other places to enter and to show their part in modernity. Other painters, artists from Sudan, from Iran, from the Caribbean, all now, in a sense, we hope being welcomed to into the modern canon. But the big looming question right now, and the proverbial white elephant in the dark room, is how in the hell do we properly move through this moment with proper considerations, proper inclusions, proper ethical stances that do not resemble performative remapping of art history, performative anti-racism? How do we change the vocabulary with which we even think about these debates? A look at so much of the literature out there has become, for many of us, a proverbial broken record, and somewhat caricature also, with the same terms being said over and over again and written over and over again. Whether somebody's talking about embodiment, intergenerational, answers, the relational. We have all read these words over and over again in the current tracks of our day speaking about equity. But how do we actually live and not talk about an embodied experience in our rapport with these debates, with our peers, and in our interface with the art and cultural objects and performances we seem to hold so dear? My residency dialogues consist of exchanges with established, international recognized curators, as well as both very new emerging artists. These are rich generative dialogues that I've already begun to have since January 1st that have become really well developed already in this residency at the Fonderie Darling. What I've decided to do is to take into account 7 recurring themes that I seem to have been seeing over the last almost 25 years of my investigating the world of cultural production. And I'd like to consider, if there is this new region of the world, could we possibly consider it from these 8 different particular themes that I see recurring? And these are the themes that I will be dialoguing with my various interlocutors. The first theme, and more than a theme, a mode of address, a narrative. I feel that these are narratives that I consistently see, ways of speaking in the kind of art and cultural production that I'm interested in, that really speak to this notion that I'm trying to develop called the new region of the world. The first is the idea of the cosmological. So in my field work among artists, this theme and concern has arisen the most. It's the one that I've heard of, that I've seen the most. The best way to speak about this is how cultural producers elaborate a world, or to use this term, comment il fait le monde, faire monde. Ultimately, the generation of objects by these producers, the atmospheres that they create, and they're all laid into a space that circulates and creates certain ambiances. But of course, at first, the construction of objects, they either speak about or describe, they also are very much about elaborating a world. As an artist, whose points of interest are the elaboration often of this personal cosmological system, is what I'm interested in. Artists which join the dots between the various objects, writings, marginalia, artifacts, sound pieces, wearable items, sculptures, sacred and profane, that all go towards making up this world. And that each one of the components seem to be eking out an interior landscape which they seem to be developing in their work. So this is the first theme. I'm thinking of artists like Bispo do Rosario in Brazil, Nep Sidhu in Toronto, Rajni Pereira, Abbas Akavan, Emery Blagden, the writer Clarice Lispector, Jay Witten, Astuko Tanaka, Eva Medin, Korakrit Arunandochai, Gabriel K. Brown, Lara Kramer, Ramel Z, Nenga Sengudi, Clara Fury, Roberto Mata. So these are kind of the artists that I'm thinking of when I think about this. The second sort of mode of narrative that I've seen consistently with a lot of the artists I've interacted that interest me is the notion of liminality and thresholds. This is this second recurring theme is something that I've noticed, and it interests me in this thinking about what we may or may not refer to as this new region of the world. As I am seeking to use this as a form of framing, or rather, moreover, of gathering and of understanding the sort of works that I see. So, like this Haitian artist C.P. Simonis, who is part of my interlocutors, I've noticed in his work, and I've encountered in his work, that beyond sort of looking at his world as something that speaks about political identity, rather what we see are lines, literal lines that become a deep dive into deeply held and complex psychical states that they are seeking to work out, unpack, reassemble, unassemble, draw, erase, implode. My continuing work with the OG Cree Mennonite artist Lara Kramer is also, we've had this mutual examination together of the lines she draws in her performances, which become spaces. The lines become spaces that are limitations, delimitations of where she walks, where she does not walk, where she might want to walk, and where she should not walk at all. In a similar way to C.P. Simonis, we have this elaboration of districts. And this I find very important, this notion of thresholds and liminal spaces that a lot of these that these artists are proposing. I can think of other artists that I'm in dialogue with, like Benjamin Camino, who works with Dana Ashby, Dana Michelle. You can think of Miles Greenberg and the space between what you see in his performers, or even an artist like Coyote Ojo. The third theme that I've seen recurring is the idea of what I would call la parole de la nuit, the night, the nocturnal. This is a concept that comes kind of out of the marginalia of working with Glissant, and it's kind of like the back catalog of his thinking. And this is a framework about the night. And I'm very interested in the night and what it represents in terms of the contemporary condition, whether it's cultural production or just contemporary life. I don't think we've invested enough thinking in this. I'm thinking literally of nightlife, of disco, and the kind of techniques that come out of that temporality and that time. Club culture, DJ culture, sound experimentation, all of these coming out of the night. And ultimately, it comes back to this idea of the parole de la nuit, which comes from Glissant, which is this notion of the primordial forest, this dark fire that we seem to be sitting around at night, where there's a kind of experimentation, a dialogue, an exchange. So deep in that forest, in the nocturnal, I think is a very interesting theme that a lot of artists that I've seen recently, that I've seen in the 20th century, it could be Arthur Russell, Larry Levan, DJs. These are experimenters who really move through the night. The fourth theme that I will be sort of addressing is what I call ancient and contemporary voice. This is a deep dive that I see in certain artists like Nep Sidhu and Rajni Pereira, where there is an arrow of time that they draw that moves effortlessly between the ancient voice and intonations of the contemporary vision. I think it's important for us to see that arrow of time, not cutting it into folklore and then into the contemporary. I think there is a complete continuity between ancient and contemporary voice. I'm thinking of people like Arca, the musician. I'm thinking of Antonin Artaud and his voyage with the Huichol and the peyote ceremonies. I'm thinking of Wilfredo Lamb. The fifth theme that I'm interested in is the haunting and the phantomal. I think we're evidently in post-colonial societies where there's almost this colonial drip, which we can almost feel palpably and at the very least feel psychically. And I think there's so many important contemporary thinkers that are expanding and bringing us into understanding what this haunting is, whether somebody is a product of a colonial society or on the other side, part of the colonizer society. I think haunting and the phantomal is very important. I'm thinking of filmmakers like Chipetong. I'm thinking of Brianta Mendoza. And these are very important scaffoldings that lie beneath our society that are key and to understand that a lot of artists working today are really able to inculcate and represent in their work. The next theme that I will be addressing in this residency is the idea of complex social identity, moving beyond the human. I think it's evident that we need to move beyond a simple notion of identity, and instead we have to understand identity as something that can be imploded. A multidisciplinary artist like Miles Greenberg is a great example of imploding this notion of identity. And of course, moving towards something beyond the human, which of course there's been a lot of dialogue about, so this is not new. So passing into something more than, whatever that is. The next theme that I'm very interested in is, and it's a long one, it's nature, culture, polis, non-space, feels, and history. I think there's a false divide which persists between nature and culture, and thus of the appropriation of culture into this space of enlightenment, superiority, and commercial overdrive and product. Both nature and culture have their respective ecosystems, which definitely influence each other, and I think it's important for us to understand this. I think it's important for us to understand and rethink what is culture, what is creativity, how has it been appropriated, how can we just take it for granted in thinking of what it is. We need to think about culture and the spaces and how they're activated. And there are many artists that I'm working with and that I'm interested in and I will dialogue with that are really addressing this particular theme. The next one is another long one called Architecture, Artifact, Object, Monument, and Artifice. How do we rethink architecture? And this is not new. This has been rethought. Rethinking architecture not just as obviously as building buildings, but as something more common, and also thinking about how people's personal sense of architecture. How do we rethink the artifact, the object, and how do we reclaim it? How do we move from a notion of abandonment of objects in religion to and sacred objects to something secular sacred? And how do we rethink the idea of monument? How do we rethink of the production of culture as a possible new form of anti-monument? I can think of artists like Matta Clark, of Juan Downey, and artists that take into account artifact, object, and recomplicate it with intentions that move beyond something flat and inanimate and secular. Works of art that have new meanings in our public spaces that actually are sites of the common and of exchange. So these are the general themes that I will be moving through in my residency, and I'm happy to have started dialogues with a couple of artists like Charles-Philippe Simonis, Alex Dervanderkat Ferrand, with Ramata Sisay, and with Lara Kramer. And these will be posted on the website. These are some summaries of what I've done so far. I'd like to just end by saying one thing. It is important to note that my journey to get to this position of having a certain stewardship and hopefully understanding how to sort of understand and actually become a real steward within these dialogues regarding production and the transmission of knowledge, more precisely of cultural and creative production and transition, my journey towards hopefully becoming some kind of steward as a curator has not come easily. Like many thinkers and cultural producers coming from other communities, my own trajectory over 25 years of writing and thinking has included both physical and symbolic violence by law and order authorities and by institutions who would have us remain within the throes of a single white-dominated view of the world. If we have in fact moved into a properly vetted so-called new region of the world, how can we begin to have these common dialogues? My goal this year is to open up the dialogues, to recomplicate the dialogues, and for us to move beyond the polarizations with new vocabularies to really begin to understand what this new region of the world actually can be. I want to thank the Fonderie Darling, Caroline Andrier, and Ruby Tello for making this happen, and I'm happy to post my most recent summaries of meetings with these 4 artists so far, and my first dialogue, which will take place with Chantal Paul-Briand, the publisher of Parachute magazine, which started in 1975 and went until 2009. We will be discussing the notion of the common. And I look forward to getting in exchanges in public with you regarding this project, the new region of the world. C'est bon, no? Yeah, it was good. It's good we got rid of the other part. Ouais, non, c'est